Hey everyone, my name is Andy Sample, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the importance of wetland restoration and the role that wetland plants play in improving water quality. In this presentation, I'm going to go over some of the reasons we've impacted wetlands in the past, what the consequences of those impacts are, and then I'll go into how we can use wetlands to address the consequences and what the plants are actually doing in the wetlands. In order to support our human populations in the US and around the world, we grow crops to feed ourselves and to feed our livestock. We also grow fiber crops to produce goods like clothes and textiles. And in order to grow these crops, we need land to cultivate them on. So we drained wetlands and we converted the land to agricultural production. One of the most impacted areas of wetland drainage and land conversion is the lower Mississippi alluvial valley, or the lower Mississippi River Basin. Historically, it was dominated by bottomland hardwood floodplain forests before the arrival and expansion of Europeans. Since then, the basin has mostly been converted to row crop agriculture, along with some pasture and urban areas. This is a zoomed in area of the Mississippi Delta, straight west of Starkville. You can see that it is mostly comprised of agricultural fields, with some oxbow lakes, some remnant forest areas, and plenty of streams meandering throughout. The top left, you can see Dahomey National Wildlife Refuge. This is a large continuous area of preserved bottomland hardwood forest, one of the largest remaining areas of remnant forest in the Delta. As you can see, there's little to no forest buffer between the fields and most of the streams to which the runoff from the fields flows. What are the consequences of these impacts? It's not only the Mississippi Delta, but agricultural runoff from the entire Mississippi River Basin that conveys nutrients into the river. Increased nitrogen in the Mississippi River builds up and eventually flows out into the Gulf of Mexico. These high nutrients fuel algal blooms. These algal blooms die and then they settle and decompose. The mass decomposition of dead algae consumes oxygen from the water. This results in the Gulf hypoxic zone. The hypoxic zone creates fish kills and impacts coastal habitats and fisheries. Other consequences of the wetland drainage in the Mississippi River Basin include increased flooding, loss of wildlife habitat, and increased erosion. So, what are some possible solutions to these problems? Well, if we look at some of the root causes of the problems, like wetland loss, it would make sense that bringing wetlands back should be considered. In a study conducted in 2001, the authors concluded that changing farming practices would be the most important solution. But the next biggest way to reduce nutrient runoff in the Mississippi would be to restore and create wetlands on the landscape. They recommended restoring approximately 5 to 13 million acres of wetlands in the lower Mississippi basin in order to significantly reduce nitrogen. But how would wetland restoration be utilized properly for this purpose? Ideally, restored wetlands should act as a buffer between drainage and runoff from the fields before that runoff water enters streams and rivers. And when the water enters those wetlands, it comes out a little cleaner. How does that actually happen? What do the plants do to reduce nutrients from agricultural runoff? If you remember back to our lab about the wastewater treatment plants, we're going to talk about much of the same processes because they happen here. First, the plants physically intercept and slow down the water from runoff and drainage. This gives sediment in the water time to settle out, as runoff from fields carrying soil deposits it here into the wetlands. Settling also reduces sediment loads in the Gulf and helps to build soil back up on the fields. The slowed flow of the water also allows for nutrient cycling processes to be carried out in the water column as well as in the inundated soil, which I'll discuss here in a moment. The increased residence time of the water in the wetland, caused by the slowing down of the flow of the water, gives the water longer exposure time to the UV rays from the sun. This exposure disinfects the water by neutralizing bacteria and viruses. So back to nutrient cycling. Plants play an important role in the nutrient cycles that happen in wetlands. In the nitrogen cycle, they directly take up inorganic forms of nitrogen, including nitrate and ammonia. These are the forms that happen to be put on these fields in the form of fertilizer. So by the time they run off into a wetland, they're ready to be taken up by the plants. The same thing goes for phosphorus. The phosphate form of phosphorus is typically what's applied to fields in the form of fertilizer, and as it runs off into the wetland, plants can directly take up phosphorus. The uptake and assimilation of these nutrients to build up plant tissues temporarily removes them from the water column and prevents them from getting washed into the Mississippi River and eventually into the Gulf. But plant uptake isn't the only process in the nutrient cycle that involves plants. Other processes occur, like when the plants die and the nutrients are released back into the soil and water through decomposition. When decomposition occurs, or in other cases after root-associated microbes transform organic nitrogen, microbes in the wetland carry out denitrification and nitrogen gas is able to leave the water and enter the atmosphere. Decomposition also releases phosphorus into the wetland, and in that case, phosphorus can bind to soil particles in the presence of certain metals and become stored in the wetland for a longer period of time. So we know that wetlands are a reliable and effective method to remove nutrients from the water. These three tables are from the book Treatment Wetlands by Cadlick and Wallace, and they show different water quality parameters taken at both the inflow and the outflow of three different constructed wetlands, one in Florida, one in California, and one in Ontario. The yellow highlighted numbers show the concentrations of different forms of nitrogen, as well as total suspended solids at the inflows of the wetlands. And the blue numbers highlighted show the same water quality parameters taken from the outflows of the wetlands. If we compare the inflows and the outflows in all three wetlands, almost all of the nitrogen parameters are lower through the outflow than they are at the inflow, while total suspended solids varied among the three wetlands. Similar results were shown for phosphorus. This table, taken from the same book, shows the effectiveness of phosphorus removal in multiple constructed wetlands. The yellow highlighted numbers show inflow phosphorus concentrations, and the blue highlighted numbers show outflow phosphorus concentrations. We can see that outflow concentrations were lower than inflow concentrations in every case. So we know that wetlands work for water quality improvement, but the solution isn't quite as easy as just restoring wetlands, because there are a lot of challenges to restoring wetlands. Challenges like invasive plants and animals. Plants can take over and outcompete preferable native species, like the Phragmites on the left, or they can shade out and change the processes within the water column, like the giant salvinia on the bottom. Invasive animals like feral pigs are often destructive to the environment and can cause disturbance which would allow for these invasive plants to move in. Other challenges include a lack of incentive for landowners to restore wetlands, as restoration requires taking land out of agricultural production, and restoration projects can be pretty costly. Loss of legal protections, like the constant changing of the waters of the United States rule, result in even less of an incentive for people to avoid impacts to wetlands and to actively restore wetlands. Aside from landowners, these projects are also costly for public agencies with low budgets, so there needs to be ways to increase incentives for wetland restoration. One good example of a way to incentivize restoration is the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Services Wetland Reserve Program. This program is an incentive for landowners that uses a conservation easement. Through this program, the NRCS will pay for part or all of the full cost of restoration, and in some cases for compensation of the easement. In some cases, the conservation easements can also be deducted from taxes as a charitable contribution. So we've covered the water quality benefits of restoration, and this program highlights that in some cases there are even financial benefits of restoration. But those aren't the only benefits. Wetland restoration can also improve flood prevention. As flooding occurs, floodwaters are not only slowed down by the plants, but the plants help remove water through evapotranspiration. They can also add to carbon sequestration, which we talked about a little bit at the beginning of the semester in this class. Many wetlands are net carbon sinks, even though they produce methane. And increasing our wetlands could help reduce greenhouse gases and slow the effects of climate change. Wetland restoration also provides extremely important habitat for resident and migratory wildlife. Water and food are necessary for all life, and wetlands provide both of these for a diversity of birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and invertebrates. Finally, people can enjoy wetlands too. There are plenty of ways to recreate out on wetlands, including paddling, wildlife viewing, photography, hunting, and fishing. They're great places to see the natural diversity of wildlife and plants. So, in conclusion, wetland restoration is a very important tool that we can use to improve water quality. Plants in these wetlands play a vital role in that water quality improvement, and wetland restoration projects should be prioritized in order for us to sustainably address water quality issues in a changing world. There are also plenty of additional benefits that make wetland restoration even more desirable. And one last thing that I want to mention is you don't have to be a professional out in the field constructing restoration wetlands in order to help. One way that everyone can help preserve wetlands if they want to is to buy a duck stamp. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service sells the duck stamp to help fund the acquisition and protection of wetland habitats and to purchase conservation easements for the National Wildlife Refuge System. The stamp is required to hunt migratory birds in the United States, but it also acts as an entrance pass to any national wildlife refuge in the country. So if you get a duck stamp, you can go into any refuge without having to pay your daily entrance fee. And that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation and maybe learned something new. And I look forward to answering your questions in the discussion. Thanks.